Nia, a single mother in her late 20s, entered the courtroom with her heart pounding in her chest. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of her worries pressing heavily on her shoulders. She clutched the hand of her 6-year-old daughter, Maya, whose innocent eyes darted around the unfamiliar space. Nia had been summoned to court over a $200 parking ticket, a sum that seemed insurmountable given her already strained finances. For her, this wasn't just about a parking fine. It was a battle between survival and sinking deeper into financial despair. As they stepped through the courtroom doors, Nia's eyes instinctively fell on the imposing figure of Judge Kalisto. Sitting behind an enormous oak desk, the judge wore an expression as stern as his reputation. Known for his no-nonsense approach to the law, Judge Kalisto had earned a fearsome name for following rules to the letter without a hint of leniency. For people in difficult situations like Nia, facing someone like him only heightened the anxiety. She had heard stories of his severe rulings, and now, standing before him, her fear grew with every passing second. The courtroom was packed with observers, some waiting for their own hearings, others just curious about the cases unfolding before them. Whispers filled the air, as though everyone was already predicting the outcome of Nia's case. The noise was a mix of idle curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. Nia could feel their eyes on her, and with each murmur, the knot in her stomach tightened. Would she be just another name in Judge Kalisto's book of unrelenting decisions? Could she convince him to show her mercy? Maya, sensing the tension in her mother, squeezed Nia's hand. Despite her young age, Maya had a way of understanding her mother's silent struggles. Nia glanced down at her daughter, offering a weak smile that barely masked the turmoil swirling inside her. This was the last place she wanted to be, especially with Maya by her side, but there was no choice. They had to face this together. As Nia stood before the judge, her voice wavered as she began to explain her situation. She spoke about how difficult it was to juggle her job at the bakery, caring for Maya, and barely making ends meet. The parking fine, she explained, had been the result of a rushed morning. She had parked in a handicapped spot to pick up Maya's medication when her daughter was sick, and by the time she returned, the ticket was already under her windshield wiper. It wasn't an excuse, she knew, but it was the reality of her life. Constantly rushing, always just a little too late, always struggling to keep everything from falling apart. But as Nia spoke, Judge Kalisto remained impassive. His stern expression never faltered, and his sharp eyes gave no indication of sympathy or understanding. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for the judge's response, while Nia's heart raced. She had prepared her case as best as she could, but she wasn't sure if her words would make any difference. The tension in the room was palpable, and everyone, including Nia, braced for what was to come next. As Nia spoke, trying to explain her circumstances to the unyielding Judge Kalisto, she felt the pressure of the moment mounting. Her palms were sweaty, her heart raced, and every word seemed to stumble out of her mouth. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that the judge wasn't really hearing her. His face was a mask of cold indifference, and his piercing gaze made it hard for Nia to keep her thoughts straight. This was a man known for following the law without bending, and Nia feared that no amount of pleading would change that. But then, as the silence in the courtroom deepened, a tiny voice broke through the tension. "Mama, I'm hungry. Can we get hamburgers?" The innocent outburst came from none other than Maya, her 6-year-old daughter, who was standing next to Nia. Completely unaware of the seriousness of the situation, Maya's small voice echoed through the courtroom, her request as natural as if they had been standing in line at a fast food restaurant instead of a court of law. Nia's heart stopped. For a split second, the entire room was frozen in stunned silence. The whispers from the audience that had been growing before now vanished, and all eyes were on the judge, waiting for his reaction. Nia's face turned pale, and her stomach dropped. She could hardly believe what had just happened. Her daughter had interrupted the court, Judge Kalisto's court, to ask for hamburgers. Nia glanced down at Maya, who stood there innocently, her large brown eyes wide with expectation. The seriousness of the moment was completely lost on her. She just wanted lunch. But this wasn't a simple interruption. This was Judge Kalisto, a man known for his strict adherence to protocol. Everyone in the courtroom expected an explosion, a sharp reprimand from the judge, a scolding that would send shivers down everyone's spine. Nia braced herself, fully expecting the worst. She quickly leaned down to Maya's level and whispered frantically, "Sweetheart, you can't interrupt the judge like that. You have to be quiet, okay?" But the damage was done. There was no taking it back. Nia's face burned with embarrassment as she stood there, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. The judge would surely think she was an irresponsible mother now, not only because of the parking violation but because her daughter had disrupted the court with a childish request. And then, the unexpected happened. Instead of the harsh scolding everyone anticipated, Judge Kalisto's expression softened. His stern face relaxed, and to the shock of everyone present, he raised his eyebrow in curiosity. He turned his gaze from Nia to Maya, and instead of chastising her, he leaned forward slightly, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Did you say hamburgers, young lady?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a warmth that no one in the courtroom had ever heard before. Maya, still oblivious to the tension her comment had caused, nodded eagerly. "Yes. I'm really hungry. We didn't have breakfast." A ripple of quiet gasps spread through the room. Nia stood frozen, completely taken aback by the judge's response. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Judge Kalisto, the strict no-nonsense judge who had a reputation for showing no mercy, was engaging in a conversation with her daughter about hamburgers. The tension in the room shifted almost instantly. The air, which had felt thick with anxiety and dread, suddenly lightened. People in the courtroom exchanged bewildered glances. The audience members who had been waiting to see Nia's fate unfold were now witnessing something completely unexpected. Nia's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and confusion. She had spent hours preparing for this hearing, going over her words and making sure her explanation would be clear and respectful. And now here she was, standing in front of the judge, while her daughter talked about food as if they were at home in their kitchen. Nia could feel her pulse racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. "Maya," Nia whispered, mortified, "this isn't the time for that." But her daughter, focused solely on her hunger, barely registered her mother's whispered plea. Judge Kalisto, however, wasn't finished. "I see," he said thoughtfully, sitting back in his chair, his stern expression momentarily replaced by a look of contemplation. "It seems like you've had a very long morning." Maya, still standing confidently next to her mother, nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. We were in a rush, and I'm really, really hungry." The room, which had been deathly quiet, suddenly erupted with soft chuckles. The absurdity of the situation, a courtroom filled with tension, now discussing hamburgers, was almost too much to believe. Nia's head was spinning. She could hardly believe this was happening. Nia's embarrassment deepened, but before she could apologize, the judge raised his hand, signaling her to stay silent. His eyes softened further as he looked at Maya. There was something about the child's innocent outburst that seemed to stir something in him. "You know," the judge said, his voice taking on a softer, almost paternal tone, "courtrooms can be very long and very boring places, especially when you're hungry." He paused, glancing at Nia before returning his gaze to Maya. "But you've been very patient. Why don't you come up here and tell me more about these hamburgers?" The courtroom was stunned. A collective gasp filled the air. Was the judge really inviting this child to speak further? What was happening? Nia's eyes widened in disbelief, and her heart pounded in her chest. She was mortified beyond belief. She had expected the judge to scold them both, to reprimand her for bringing Maya into the courtroom and to punish her for not controlling her child. But instead, Judge Kalisto was inviting Maya to the front, asking her about hamburgers, of all things. Nia didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Maya, seeing the opportunity, looked up at her mother for permission. Nia, still in shock and unsure of what to do, nodded slowly. What else could she do? This was beyond anything she had anticipated. With a bright smile on her face, Maya skipped happily toward the judge's bench. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. As Maya approached, Judge Kalisto sat back in his chair, an amused glint in his eyes. It was clear that something about this little girl had touched him. Something had shifted in his normally impenetrable demeanor. Nia could only stand there, heart racing, as she watched her daughter and the judge interact. What had begun as a tense, nerve-wracking court appearance had suddenly taken an unexpected turn, one that neither Nia nor anyone else in the room could have ever predicted. As Maya stood by the judge, her innocent chatter about hamburgers lightening the tense atmosphere in the courtroom, Nia's mind drifted back to the chain of events that had led her here. The weight of her circumstances pressed heavily on her shoulders, and she struggled to keep her composure in front of the entire courtroom. She had come here today, burdened with more than just a parking fine. Her life had become a series of overwhelming challenges, each more difficult than the last. And today, it felt as though everything was about to unravel. Nia was a single mother, doing her best to raise Maya on her own. After Maya's father had left when she was only 3 years old, Nia had been left to shoulder the responsibility of parenthood entirely by herself. She worked long hours at a local bakery, where she baked cakes and pastries, often staying late into the night to make enough money to support her daughter. When she wasn't at the bakery, she picked up shifts as a server at a nearby restaurant, struggling to make ends meet. Despite the long hours and exhaustion, Nia did everything she could to give Maya a stable and happy life. But it wasn't easy. Being a single mother meant that Nia rarely had time for herself. Every morning was a blur of waking Maya up, getting her ready for school, and rushing to her job at the bakery. There was never enough time, never enough money, and never enough rest. Nia often found herself at the breaking point, wondering how much longer she could keep up the pace. Her love for Maya was the only thing that kept her going, and she worked tirelessly to make sure her daughter had what she needed. That morning, the one that led to this court appearance, had been particularly rough. Maya had woken up sniffling and coughing, her little body showing signs of a cold. As Nia rushed to get ready for work, she couldn't ignore the growing worry gnawing at her. Maya wasn't feeling well, and Nia needed to get her some medicine before the symptoms worsened. But time was already slipping away. She had to get to the bakery for her early morning shift, and she knew she couldn't be late, not again. As she hurried Maya into her coat and grabbed her things, Nia felt the familiar surge of panic. It seemed like every moment of her life was a race against the clock. She couldn't afford to miss work, but she also couldn't leave Maya without her medicine. And so, she made a quick decision. She would stop by the pharmacy on the way to work and grab what she needed for Maya's cold. But as fate would have it, that morning, the traffic lights seemed to conspire against her. What should have been a quick stop turned into a nightmare of red lights and traffic jams. By the time she finally pulled into the pharmacy parking lot, Nia was already running late. Her heart raced as she scanned the parking spaces, her anxiety mounting when she realized there wasn't a single available spot near the entrance. Every space was filled, except for one, the handicapped parking spot right by the door. Nia knew she wasn't supposed to park there. She had been raised to follow the rules, to respect the law. But in that moment, desperation took over. Maya's coughs echoed from the back seat, and Nia could feel her chest tightening with fear. She needed to get inside quickly, grab the medicine, and get Maya to school and herself to work on time. Surely, she thought, it would only take a few minutes. She wouldn't be in there long. No one would notice. So, with a mixture of guilt and urgency, Nia parked in the handicapped space. She rushed inside the pharmacy, her heart pounding as she darted through the aisles to find what she needed. But as is often the case when you're in a hurry, everything seemed to take longer than expected. The line at the pharmacy counter was longer than usual, and by the time she finally got the medicine and made her way back outside, she knew she had been gone for more than just a few minutes. When she saw the bright orange envelope tucked under her windshield wiper, her heart sank. A parking ticket. A $200 fine for parking illegally. The weight of the number hit her like a punch to the gut. For most people, $200 might be an inconvenience, but for Nia, it was a crisis. That $200 represented groceries, gas, and bills. It represented the difference between making ends meet and falling further behind. Nia stood there, holding the ticket in her hand, feeling the world crumble around her. Back in the courtroom, as Nia recounted the incident, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. She hadn't planned on sharing so much. She hadn't planned on opening up about the difficulties she faced as a single mother. But as Maya stood next to the judge, talking about hamburgers and her mother's job at the bakery, Nia realized that this wasn't just about a parking ticket. This was about her life, the constant struggle to keep everything together, to provide for her daughter, and to stay afloat in a world that seemed determined to push her down. Judge Kalisto, who had started the day as a figure of fear and authority in Nia's mind, was listening intently. His once stern expression had softened as Maya innocently described how hard her mother worked, often putting in late hours at the bakery and serving tables to make ends meet. The judge asked a few more questions, not about the parking violation, but about Nia's life, about her job, her responsibilities as a mother, and the challenges she faced every day. As Nia answered, her voice trembling with emotion, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The audience, which had initially been murmuring with curiosity about the outcome of a simple parking violation, now sat in silence, hanging on every word. They weren't just hearing a story about a parking ticket anymore. They were hearing the story of a woman who was doing everything she could to survive, to provide for her child, and to navigate a life full of hardship and sacrifice. And Judge Kalisto, the man known for being strict and unyielding, was no longer just the cold figure behind the bench. For the first time, Nia saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected: empathy. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a space where Nia's story, her struggles, and her resilience were laid bare for all to see. And as she looked around, Nia realized that, for the first time, she wasn't just being judged. She was being understood. As Nia stood in front of the courtroom, her voice trembling from recounting her struggles, it was Maya who unknowingly took center stage. The 6-year-old girl, completely unaware of the weight of the situation, gazed up at Judge Kalisto with her wide, innocent eyes. The solemn atmosphere of the courtroom had been pierced by Maya's innocent request for hamburgers, and now, as the eyes of the judge and the audience shifted to her, she began to explain her mother's struggles in a way only a child could: simple, pure, and without pretense. "Mommy works so hard," Maya said, her voice clear and unwavering. She wasn't embarrassed, nor did she understand the gravity of speaking in front of a courtroom. To her, this was just another conversation about her mother, the woman she adored and admired. "She bakes cakes and cookies and stays late at the restaurant sometimes. We don't always have dinner together because she's working. But that's okay, 'cause she says she's doing it for me." Maya's words cut through the tension in the room like a knife. The courtroom, which had been filled with whispers and anticipation just moments ago, now fell into a hushed silence. Every eye was fixed on the little girl standing beside her mother, her small voice carrying a weight far greater than anyone had expected. What had started as an innocent request for food was quickly evolving into something much deeper. Maya wasn't just asking for hamburgers, she was telling the world about her life, and more importantly, about her mother's sacrifices. Judge Kalisto leaned forward in his chair, his interest piqued. His expression softened as he listened to Maya's unfiltered truth. The stern and unyielding mask he had worn when Nia first stood before him was starting to crack. There was something about this little girl, her honesty, her innocence, that made it impossible for him to remain indifferent. He had seen countless cases in his courtroom, handed down fines and judgments with cold efficiency, but never had a child's words struck him like this. "And sometimes Mommy comes home really tired," Maya continued, her voice slightly wavering but still filled with sincerity. "She says she has to work a lot, 'cause we need money for food and rent. She's always busy, but she never forgets to hug me before bed." Maya looked over at Nia, who was now blinking back tears. "She's the best mommy," Maya added, a small smile spreading across her face. Nia could hardly bear to look at her daughter. Maya's innocent words were laying bare the truth of her life in front of everyone: the endless hours, the exhaustion, the constant worry about making ends meet. It was one thing to experience these struggles herself, but to hear them recounted by her child, to see them from Maya's perspective, was almost too much to handle. Nia's heart ached as she realized just how much Maya understood about their situation, far more than she had ever intended for her daughter to know. Judge Kalisto's curiosity deepened as he asked, "And what does your mommy do when she's not working?" Maya shifted slightly, her hands clasped in front of her as she considered the question. "She takes care of me," she said. "We play sometimes, but she's always so tired. I know she tries really hard." There was a collective intake of breath in the courtroom. The picture Maya was painting was one of a single mother doing everything she could, sacrificing her own needs and happiness to provide for her child. The courtroom, which had once seemed like a cold, sterile place of judgment, was now transformed into a space of raw human empathy. It wasn't just about a parking fine anymore. It was about survival, about a mother who had been pushed to her limits and a daughter who was wise beyond her years because of it. The judge's voice softened further as he continued, "Your mommy must love you very much to work so hard." Maya nodded emphatically, her curls bouncing. "She does. She tells me every day. She says she'll do anything to make sure we have a good life. But it's hard sometimes. She gets sad when she doesn't have enough money. I can tell." At this, Nia's composure cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she struggled to hold them back. She hadn't realized just how much Maya had noticed, how deeply her daughter had felt the strain of their situation. Nia had tried so hard to protect her, to shield her from the harsh realities of their life, but it was clear that Maya understood more than she had ever imagined. Judge Kalisto, too, seemed to be affected by Maya's words. The stern judge, known for his unwavering adherence to the law, was visibly moved. The child standing before him wasn't just any child. She was a reflection of a life of hardship, resilience, and love. For the first time, he saw Nia not as a defendant but as a mother, someone who was struggling to give her daughter the best life she could under circumstances that were anything but easy. The mood in the courtroom shifted dramatically. People who had been whispering about Nia's parking violation were now sitting in silence, their expressions softening as they listened to Maya's heartfelt words. It was as if the entire room had taken on a new perspective. What had begun as a routine case was now a story of a family fighting to stay afloat, of a mother who had done everything right but was still drowning in the pressures of life. The turning point came when Judge Kalisto, his voice no longer stern but filled with compassion, asked Maya, "Do you think your mommy deserves to be punished for parking in the wrong spot?" Maya looked up at the judge, her large brown eyes filled with confusion. "No," she said simply, as though the answer should have been obvious. "Mommy didn't mean to break the rules. She was just trying to help me feel better. She's a good mommy." There was a pause, a long, heavy silence that hung in the air. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. For the first time, Nia felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just maybe, Maya's innocent words had reached the judge's heart. Perhaps he would understand now. Perhaps he would see that this wasn't just about a parking fine, it was about so much more. Judge Kalisto sat back in his chair, his face unreadable for a moment. But then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you, Maya," he said softly. "You've given me a lot to think about." As he turned his attention back to Nia, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. The tension was gone, replaced by a feeling of understanding and empathy. Nia, who had entered the courtroom fearing the worst, now stood there, still nervous but filled with a cautious sense of relief. She didn't know what the judge's final decision would be, but one thing was clear: Maya had changed everything. With one innocent request for hamburgers, Maya had done what no lawyer or argument could have accomplished. She had humanized the situation. She had reminded everyone in the room, including the judge, that behind every case, every ticket, and every fine, there were real people with real struggles. And sometimes, all it took was the honesty of a child to make the world see things a little differently. As the courtroom held its breath, waiting for Judge Kalisto's final verdict, the air was thick with tension. Nia stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, bracing herself for the worst. The judge had a reputation for being strict and unyielding, and although Maya's innocent words had softened the atmosphere, Nia couldn't be sure if they had truly reached the judge's heart. She knew how the system worked. There was no room for leniency, no matter how genuine her situation was. But then, something remarkable happened, something no one in the room could have predicted. Judge Kalisto leaned back in his chair, his steely gaze softening as he looked at Maya. The strictness that had once defined him seemed to melt away, replaced by a warmth that few had ever seen in his courtroom. He cleared his throat, and the entire room seemed to hang on his every word. "Maya," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I understand that you're hungry, and I can see how much you care about your mother. You've been very patient during all of this." Maya, who had been clutching her mother's hand nervously, looked up at the judge with wide, innocent eyes. She nodded shyly, unsure of what to say. Nia, standing beside her daughter, was still in shock. This was not the stern and unyielding judge she had expected. She could hardly believe that the man who had a reputation for following the law to the letter was speaking so kindly to her daughter. Judge Kalisto turned to the bailiff standing near the bench and, in a move that stunned everyone, said, "Why don't we take a short break? Please have someone bring a sandwich and a juice box for young Maya here. She shouldn't have to sit through this on an empty stomach." The courtroom gasped. Nia's eyes widened in disbelief, and Maya's face lit up with joy. She looked at her mother, her small hand squeezing Nia's as if to say, "See, Mommy? It's all going to be okay." For a moment, Nia didn't know how to react. This was not the outcome she had anticipated when she walked into the courtroom that morning. She had expected harsh judgment, a hefty fine, and more hardship, but instead, she was witnessing an unexpected act of kindness that left her speechless. The bailiff nodded and quickly left the room, while the rest of the courtroom remained in stunned silence. People began to whisper among themselves, their shock palpable. This was the same Judge Kalisto who was known for his strict rulings, yet here he was, ordering a sandwich for a hungry little girl in the middle of a court session. The courtroom, usually a place of cold, hard decisions, had suddenly become a space of compassion and humanity. As the minutes passed, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, but they were not murmurs of discontent. Rather, they were whispers of relief and astonishment. People smiled at one another, some nodding in approval. The tension that had once gripped the room was dissipating, replaced by a feeling of shared warmth. It was as if Maya's innocence had reminded everyone that, beyond the laws and regulations, there were human lives involved, lives that sometimes needed a little compassion. When the bailiff returned, he carried a brown paper bag and a small juice box. Maya's eyes lit up as he handed the bag to her with a kind smile. "Here you go, young lady," he said. "This should take care of that hunger of yours." Maya eagerly opened the bag and pulled out a neatly wrapped sandwich. Her small hands fumbled with the wrapping, but her excitement was clear. She looked up at the judge, who was watching her with a rare softness in his eyes. "Thank you," Maya said, her voice full of gratitude as she took a bite of the sandwich. The sight of her joy brought smiles to many faces in the room, and even Judge Kalisto, known for his stoic demeanor, couldn't help but smile. Nia, standing beside her daughter, felt a lump rise in her throat. The overwhelming relief she felt in that moment was almost too much to bear. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or frustration, they were tears of gratitude. Judge Kalisto watched Maya for a few moments longer before turning his attention back to Nia. His face, though still serious, had softened considerably. He could see the exhaustion in Nia's eyes, the weight of her struggles as a single mother. He had heard countless cases over the years, but something about this one had touched him deeply. Perhaps it was Maya's innocence, or perhaps it was Nia's quiet determination to do right by her daughter despite the overwhelming challenges she faced. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Kalisto began, addressing Nia formally once again, but with a tone that was far gentler than before. "I want to commend you for the way you've raised your daughter. It's clear to me that you've been doing everything you can to provide for her, even under difficult circumstances." Nia swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had never expected to hear such words from this judge, and they hit her like a wave. She nodded silently, her throat too tight to speak. The judge continued, "I've had time to reflect on your case, and while the law is important, I also believe that the law should be used as a tool of justice and compassion. I can see that this parking ticket was not an act of negligence, but rather a moment of desperation during a challenging time in your life." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before delivering his final decision. "Therefore," he said, his voice firm but kind, "I am going to dismiss the parking ticket. You will not be required to pay the fine." The courtroom erupted into murmurs of astonishment once again. This was not the outcome anyone had expected, least of all Nia. She stared at the judge in disbelief, her hand flying to her mouth as tears of relief spilled down her cheeks. She had come to court expecting to leave in even more financial despair, but now it felt as though a massive weight had been lifted off her shoulders. "Thank you, Your Honor," Nia finally managed to say, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Judge Kalisto offered her a small, reassuring smile. "There's no need to thank me," he replied. "Sometimes, justice requires understanding the human side of the law." As the courtroom slowly began to disperse, Nia stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by the events that had just unfolded. Maya, now finished with her sandwich, tugged on her mother's hand, her face bright with happiness. "Mommy, the judge was nice," she said with a smile. Nia nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Yes, baby," she whispered, "he was." As they left the courtroom, Nia couldn't help but glance back at Judge Kalisto, who was still sitting behind his desk, watching them with thoughtful eyes. In that moment, she realized that it wasn't just Maya's hunger that had been fed, it was also the compassion and humanity of the courtroom itself. The law, in its rigidity, had made room for kindness, and it was something neither Nia nor Maya would ever forget. Judge Kalisto, too, sat in quiet reflection after they left. He had made countless rulings in his career, but something about this case had reminded him that justice was not always black and white. Sometimes, it was about looking beyond the rules and seeing the people behind them. As the break came to an end, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt noticeably different. The tension that had filled the room when Nia first stood before Judge Kalisto had been replaced by a quiet but palpable sense of anticipation. Everyone was still reeling from the judge's unexpected kindness towards Maya. The courtroom that had once seemed harsh and indifferent now felt like a space where something remarkable had just occurred. Nia sat beside Maya, her heart still pounding, but now with a mixture of hope and relief rather than fear. She glanced down at her daughter, who was happily finishing her juice box, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Nia's thoughts raced. Could it be possible that Judge Kalisto had seen something in their case, something that might sway him to show them leniency? She didn't dare let herself hope too much, but the judge's unexpected act of kindness had certainly shifted the mood. The bailiff called the court back to order, and the quiet murmur of voices quickly faded. Everyone turned their attention to the front of the room, where Judge Kalisto was once again seated behind his imposing desk. His demeanor had shifted slightly. The stern and unyielding expression that had defined his reputation was now softer, more thoughtful. As he shuffled through the papers in front of him, there was a momentary silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, Judge Kalisto looked up, his gaze landing squarely on Nia. She straightened in her seat, bracing herself for his final verdict. The judge cleared his throat, and the courtroom leaned in, waiting for his words. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "I've reviewed your case more carefully during the recess." Nia held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she could almost hear it. She could feel every pair of eyes in the courtroom on her, waiting to see how this would unfold. "Upon further examination," the judge continued, "I see that your driving record is completely clean. In fact, this is your first infraction in nearly 9 years. You've had no prior parking violations, no traffic violations, nothing that would indicate a pattern of reckless behavior." Nia felt a flicker of hope. Was this really happening? Could the judge be reconsidering his initial stance? Judge Kalisto's eyes softened as he spoke, and his voice, though still firm, carried a note of understanding. "You explained to the court earlier the circumstances that led to this parking violation, and while the law is the law, I recognize that there are moments when we must consider the context in which an infraction occurs." The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. No one dared to move, as if any sudden motion might disrupt the delicate balance of the moment. "I understand," the judge continued, "that you were acting out of desperation. Your daughter was sick, you were pressed for time, and you made a decision that you felt was necessary in that moment." Nia swallowed hard, tears already welling up in her eyes. The kindness in his words, the acknowledgment of her struggle, was something she had not expected. For so long, she had felt unseen, as though her hardships and sacrifices as a single mother were invisible to the world. But now, here was someone in a position of power who not only saw her, but understood her. Judge Kalisto glanced down at his papers once more before raising his gaze back to Nia. "Given your clean record, and the circumstances you've outlined, I have decided to dismiss the parking fine in its entirety." For a split second, the courtroom was stunned into silence, as though no one could believe what they had just heard. Then, as if a dam had broken, the room erupted into applause. The courtroom audience, who had been watching the proceedings with bated breath, burst into cheers and clapping. It was an unusual display of emotion for a courtroom known for its strictness, but the moment was so profound that no one could contain their admiration for the judge's unexpected leniency. Nia sat frozen in her seat for a moment, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Her parking fine, $200 that she could never have afforded, was gone. The weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks, the stress that had kept her awake at night, was suddenly lifted off her shoulders. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to look at Maya, who was beaming up at her, completely unaware of the monumental shift that had just taken place. Nia reached for her daughter's hand and squeezed it tightly, overwhelmed by emotion. This was more than she had ever dared hope for. "Thank you, Your Honor," Nia finally managed to say, her voice trembling with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you enough." Judge Kalisto, who had once seemed so intimidating and distant, offered her a small but genuine smile. "There's no need to thank me, Ms. Johnson," he replied, his tone kind. "Sometimes, justice requires more than just enforcing the law. It requires understanding the people who come before us." Nia nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. She had expected this day to end in defeat, another crushing blow in her long struggle to make ends meet. But instead, she had been shown kindness, kindness that she never thought would come from someone like Judge Kalisto. As the courtroom began to disperse, people approached Nia with kind words and congratulations. "You deserve this," one woman whispered to her. "I'm so glad the judge saw what a good mother you are." Nia could only nod through her tears. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not just as a woman struggling under the weight of life's challenges, but as a mother who had done everything she could to provide for her daughter. Maya, still holding her mother's hand, looked up at Judge Kalisto as they prepared to leave. "Thank you for the sandwich, Mr. Judge," she said with a sweet smile. The judge chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're welcome, Maya. I hope you and your mother have a much better day from here on out." As Nia and Maya walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, Nia felt a sense of relief wash over her. She knew that life would still have its challenges. There would still be bills to pay, shifts to work, and endless responsibilities to juggle. But for now, she allowed herself to breathe, to enjoy this moment of reprieve. And as they stepped out into the sunlight, Nia realized something else. She wasn't alone. People had seen her struggle today, and they had shown her compassion. She wasn't just another case number or another mother fighting to survive. She was a person deserving of empathy, and today, for the first time in a long time, that empathy had made all the difference. As the applause in the courtroom slowly died down and the crowd began to filter out, Judge Kalisto remained seated, deep in thought. The moment had left a lasting impression on him, far more than he had expected when he first walked into court that morning. His interaction with Nia and Maya had stirred something inside him, something that had long been dormant. He realized that there was more to justice than simply enforcing rules and handing out punishments. There was a need for empathy, a need to understand the people behind the cases he presided over. As Nia gathered her things, preparing to leave the courtroom with Maya, Judge Kalisto cleared his throat, signaling that he wasn't quite done. The noise in the courtroom stilled, and Nia paused, turning back towards the bench with a questioning look. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Kalisto called, his voice softer than before. He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Before you go, I have something else for you." Nia furrowed her brow, unsure of what he meant. She hesitated, walking back toward the judge's bench, while Maya stayed close by her side, her small hand gripping her mother's. The atmosphere in the room, which had shifted from tension to relief, now seemed filled with anticipation again. Judge Kalisto held the paper out towards Nia. "This is a list of local resources," he explained. "I see many people come through this courtroom, and I've learned that sometimes people need more than a dismissal of their charges. They need a helping hand, a way to move forward." He gestured to the paper. "There are organizations in this city that provide support for single mothers. You'll find information here about child care assistance, job training programs, and career advancement opportunities. Some of these organizations even offer online courses that are free or very affordable." Nia's eyes widened as she took the paper from him, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced down at the list, reading the names of organizations she had never heard of before. Child care support, affordable housing programs, job placement services. It was a treasure trove of resources that she desperately needed but never knew existed. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she looked back at the judge, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Your Honor. This means more to me than you know." Judge Kalisto nodded, his face solemn but warm. "I know it's not easy raising a child on your own while trying to make ends meet. The law can only do so much. But these resources," he pointed to the paper in her hand, "they're there to help you build a better future for yourself and for Maya." Nia glanced down at Maya, who was looking up at the judge with wide, innocent eyes. This gesture of kindness from a man known for his strict and unyielding demeanor was more than she had ever expected. It wasn't just about the parking fine anymore. It was about the possibility of a brighter future, a future that didn't feel so overwhelming and uncertain. For so long, Nia had been caught in the relentless cycle of working multiple jobs, trying to make ends meet, and never feeling like she had enough time or energy for Maya. The thought of getting help, real help, seemed like a distant dream. But now, with this list in her hands, that dream felt closer than ever. The burden she had carried for so long suddenly felt a little lighter. Nia took a deep breath, her heart swelling with a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, she could see a path forward, one that didn't involve constant struggle, but instead, opportunity. The resources listed on the paper would give her access to affordable childcare, which meant she wouldn't have to juggle as many shifts at the bakery or take on extra hours as a waitress just to make sure Maya was looked after. The job training programs would allow her to learn new skills, and maybe, just maybe, she could pursue the dream of a better career, one that offered stability and a future. Maya tugged at her mother's hand, and Nia glanced down, meeting her daughter's eager eyes. "Mommy," Maya whispered, "what's on the paper?" Is it more sandwiches? Nia let out a soft laugh, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. No, sweetie, she said, kneeling down to Maya's level. This is something even better. This is going to help us a lot. Judge Kalisto watched the exchange between mother and daughter, and for the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond the usual scope of his duties. As a judge, he had always prided himself on upholding the law, on being fair and impartial. But today, he had been reminded that justice wasn't always about enforcing rules to the letter. Sometimes, it was about understanding the people behind the cases, about recognizing their struggles and offering them a chance to rebuild. He realized that, in many ways, he had been hardened by the countless cases he had presided over, cases of theft, fraud, assault, where the people standing in front of him were little more than criminals in his eyes. But Nia and Maya had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that every person who walks into a courtroom has a story. And sometimes, those stories are filled with hardship and pain, with struggles that can't be resolved by a simple verdict. For the first time in a long while, Judge Kalisto felt a shift in himself. He had always believed that the law was about enforcing order and protecting society. But today, he understood that the law could also be a tool for compassion, for lifting people up when they were at their lowest. As Nia and Maya turned to leave the courtroom, Judge Kalisto called after them one more time. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice kind, "I wish you and your daughter all the best. And remember, you're stronger than you think." Nia smiled, her heart full of gratitude and hope. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said softly, "for everything." As the door closed behind them, Judge Kalisto leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the events of the day. He had always believed that justice was about consequences, about making people face the results of their actions. But today, he had learned that sometimes justice could be about second chances, about offering people the opportunity to change their circumstances for the better. And in that moment, Judge Kalisto knew that he, too, had been changed by this experience. The law wasn't just about punishment. It was about understanding the human condition, about recognizing that even the smallest act of kindness could have a profound impact on someone's life. As he looked around the now empty courtroom, Judge Kalisto made a silent promise to himself. From this day forward, he would approach each case with a little more empathy, a little more understanding. Because sometimes, the people who needed justice the most weren't the ones who deserved punishment, but the ones who deserved a chance to hope again. In the days following the courtroom encounter, news of Judge Kalisto's unexpected act of kindness quickly spread. Social media buzzed with posts about the judge who had not only dismissed a parking fine but also showed deep compassion to a struggling single mother and her daughter. Videos and articles highlighting the moment when the judge handed Maya a sandwich and offered Nia a list of resources went viral, touching the hearts of people across the country. Many were moved by the rare display of empathy in a space often associated with strict rules and harsh judgments. It was a reminder that humanity could shine through even in the most formal settings. For Nia, the impact of that day went far beyond the dismissal of the parking ticket. With the burden of the fine lifted and the unexpected support from Judge Kalisto, she felt a newfound sense of hope. She wasted no time putting the judge's list of resources to use. Nia enrolled in an online degree program, something she had long dreamed of but never thought possible amidst her busy life. With the prospect of better job opportunities in the future, Nia felt excited for the first time in a long while. She also found a childcare program that offered affordable and flexible options, giving her more time to focus on her studies and on building a more stable life for herself and Maya. Maya, unaware of the full magnitude of what had happened, continued to beam with happiness about the sandwich and juice she had received from the judge. But Nia knew that day had been a turning point. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the shift in their future. The small act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would change their lives for the better. Meanwhile, Judge Kalisto found himself reflecting on the experience, too. The interaction with Nia and Maya had struck a chord deep within him. It had reminded him that the law, while rigid, could also be a tool for compassion. The lesson that day stayed with him, and it transformed the way he approached his future cases. He began to take a closer look at the people behind the cases in his courtroom, recognizing their struggles and treating them with more empathy. Judge Kalisto realized that while rules were important, justice should also include understanding and humanity. As weeks turned into months, Nia's life continued to improve. The viral story of Judge Kalisto's kindness continued to inspire others to approach people's hardships with greater compassion. Nia, with her growing confidence and support network, began to feel that a brighter future for her and Maya was not only possible but within reach. And as Judge Kalisto presided over more cases, his courtroom became known not just for its strict adherence to the law, but also for its fairness and empathy. The lesson of that day, a lesson of compassion and understanding, would be remembered by all who had witnessed it.